Jetzt Evgeny Morozov hier begrüßen zu dürfen. Ich habe ihn gefragt, ob es okay ist, dass ich in Deutsch kurz die Einführung mache. Er hat genickt. Ich danke für das Vertrauen und halte das wieder ganz kurz. Evgeny Morozov ist einer der aktivsten und viel beachteten Autoren und Kritiker der aktuellen Wechselwirkungen digitaler Technologie und Politik. Und ich denke, ein Punkt, der ihn auszeichnet, wenn ich das persönlich sagen darf, ist, dass er eigentlich kein Interesse daran hat, zu den Internet-Intellektuellen zu gehören, sondern genau diesen Stand massiv kritisiert und in die Pflicht nimmt und die Frage stellt, von welcher Basis aus wird da gesprochen, was ist das Ziel der Rede, was sind die Perspektiven, die eingeschlagen werden und wie steht es um die Verantwortlichkeiten zu den politischen Konsequenzen, die damit verbunden sind und verbunden werden können. Er schreibt unter anderem für Publikationen wie New Yorker, The New York Magazine, London Review of Books, monatliche Kolumne, erscheint in Deutschland unter anderem in der Frankfurter Allgemeinen Zeitung, nicht zu reden von seinem Twitter-Account, den ich auch wärmstens empfehlen kann. 2011 hat er sein erstes Buch vorgelegt, The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom. 2013 erschien To Save Everything, Click Here, The Folly of Technological Solutionism. Auf Deutsch dann erschien im selben Jahr Smarte neue Welt, digitale Technik und die Freiheit des Menschen. Er schreibt derzeit an 2 Büchern. Das eine ist eine Polemik über die Zukunft des öffentlichen Raums und das andere eine Geschichte der digitalen Kultur seit 1945. Ich freue mich sehr, dass er bei uns ist und zu sprechen über das Thema, steht schon da, ich muss nicht vorlesen. Vielen Dank. Herzlich willkommen, Evgeny Morozov.
Can you hear me? Yeah. No, thank you so much for the introduction. I don't write for New York Magazine, just one point of clarification. Good. So the title of my talk today is something of an inside joke. For those of you who might have read my last book, there I explicitly state my decision to basically ban myself from ever using the term the internet without putting it in scare quotes. So every time I use it now, I use it in a very ironic kind of mode, and it's been a bit of a struggle with all of my editors and publishers to get by, convincing them that they should not actually include the word the internet whenever they publish any of my articles, because all of them sooner or later get struck by the fact that all of these complex sentences that I write can actually be simplified just by basically changing a long sentence into one word, the internet, and getting away with it. And my insistence for the last 2 years has been that that's probably not a very good idea. And today I kind of want to explain why I think it's not a good idea, and also try to articulate what can we gain if we leave not just the term, the internet, because it's far more than just a term, but also an entire way of thinking and speaking behind us. So again, to make it easier for those of you who wouldn't stay until the end, it is possible, in fact, to function and publish best-selling books without ever using the term. So that's probably one of the few good news that I'll deliver today. But beyond that, for me, the interest in problematizing, if you will, the very term and the discourse around it did come out of the 2 books that I've written. In the first book, which came out mostly of my own very practical hands-on experience as an activist, working in the former Soviet Union, trying to deploy some of the tools of social media to push for democratization and to work with activists and politicians and journalists and teach them about the power of social media, Twitter, Facebook, wikis at that point. And what I discovered while doing that work, and which is what also led me to write my first book, was that a lot of the very senior policymakers we were dealing with, a lot of the people who were actually shaping policy in Washington and Brussels, in many national capitals, got extremely fascinated with the idea of internet freedom, and they started using it as a catch-all term to talk about anything that kind of implied democratization, freedom of expression, human rights, and so on. And it's a term that, if you think about it closely, actually is extremely ambiguous. And I think it's very ambiguity that has resulted in its wide embrace by the policymaking circles, despite all the hypocrisy involved in having somebody like Hillary Clinton, who at the time was Secretary of State, deliver 3 high-profile speeches about the virtues of internet freedom while her own government was engaged in the most expensive program of internet surveillance. Right? And the way in which certain governments, particularly the American government, has emerged as one of the advocates of internet freedom, while at the same time it was doing everything it could, not just in terms of surveillance, but also in terms of various positions they took on trade policy, various positions they took on how they wanted to crack down on piracy, for example, how they went after various copyright violations, everything that they did. If you thought about it from any kind of reasonable perspective, indicated that that was not a government that was really an ally of any kind of internet freedom, while at the same time, the rhetoric that was coming out of Washington was all about, we want to promote it, we want to defend it, we want to be its leading advocates. And for me, that prompted me to start looking a little bit deeper into the very question of what role does the very notion of the internet play in many of these foreign policy debates, because it clearly allows certain positions to become more believable and more, generate more attraction and buzz, if you will, than others. What I have discovered, having written that book and moved to another one where I shifted my focus from how we think and talk about China and Russia and Iran and states like that, and to move towards our own backyard, whether it's Western Europe or North America, I discovered that a lot of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, a lot of technology startups, also greatly profit from the immense amount of ambiguity that exists around the term and many associated terms around it. It's an entire constellation of terms, I would argue, like the internet. You would hear constantly companies like Google and Facebook justify what they do by claiming that we are living through the era of internet revolution, we are living through a time of disruption, we are living through a time of information revolution. They would be constantly invoking certain tropes. And if you paid attention to that discourse, which I must assure you is extremely painful because there is a lot of bullshit flying around and it's very hard to read it on a daily basis, but that's a job that you probably have to force yourself to do if you want to actually understand how they frame what they do. They will quickly realize that there are certain assumptions about the exceptionality, if you will, of the contemporary era. So there are definitely claims about time. There are also claims about coherence. So the idea is that all of the changes we are seeing, for example, whether it's Skype or whether it's Napster or whether it's Google or whether it's Facebook, they are all enabled by a certain logic, and that logic has coherent effects. And you can analyze those effects and theorize them and produce some kind of a body of knowledge that you could call internet theory. And a lot of the people who have emerged as so-called internet intellectuals, if you want to use that label, whether it's people like Clay Shirky, for example, right? I mean, the entire mode of thinking and analysis is based on applying the Napster model to different social domains. So he would come and say, well, journalism, you're about to hit the Napster moment. Education, you're about to hit the Napster moment. Governments, you're about to hit the Napster moment. You will all be disrupted, you will all be decentralized, you will all be faced with a set of extremely well-informed citizens and amateurs, and they will all be doing things that more or less look coherent, and you can move from industry to industry and detect those effects. And the underlying claim that I think was informing a lot of this analysis was that, of course, all of those changes were in one way or another enabled by this great force, the internet, and we can go and coherently study it and attribute all of the changes we were seeing, whether it's in journalism or education or publishing or social organization. By the way, that was also the school of thought that gave us a lot of excitement and optimism about what we were seeing in the Middle East, because it was, again, the authoritarian governments were experiencing the Napster moment. They were about to get disrupted by activists who can now mobilize with the help of mobile phones, text messaging, social media, and so forth. All of those claims, I would say, relied also on a particular set of assumptions about the coherence of the changes we were seeing. And then, you know, if you go a little bit further, you will see all sorts of other assumptions about disruption, about the fact that disruption in itself is good, and it's an indicator of progress, and that hackers have emerged as some kind of a new social force that are never content with things as they are, and that we will always see new kind of disruptions happening, and those disruptions in themselves are a positive force, right? And that explains why a lot of the buzz in Silicon Valley right now uses that word so much. It's come to be seen as a natural consequence, again, of living in the era of the internet. It's that there will be perpetual disruption, and that disruption will be enabled by hackers and so forth. Of course, if you have any historical or political or economic sensibility, you would see that the figure of the hacker as presented by Mark Zuckerberg, for example, and that's the figure that, as I've said, is never content with the contemporary situation and is always eager to innovate and disrupt, is not that different from the figure of the entrepreneur that somebody like Schumpeter had presented. And the idea of the internet era always disrupting things is not also very different from the way in which capitalism itself has always been conceptualized throughout history, right? So the ways in which the internet discourse has come to function as a substitute for many other discourses, for me also became an interesting issue that I tried to, I investigated it somewhat in my second book, but my real task there was something else. So that had led me, those two experiments and those two experiences, on the one hand, understanding the internet freedom debate, on the other hand, understanding this disruption and solutionism business with Silicon Valley, again, emerging as the default, not just default source of innovation, but also default provider of every possible solution to every possible political and social problem, had made me to question the way in which the internet does operate as some kind of a meta-narrative in our culture, despite all of the pronouncements about their death. That it is one organizing theme and episteme that we constantly refer to in many of the debates, whether also debates about foreign policy or economy or education or you name it. And for me, it became a very interesting question: what does that theme, as an organizing theme of our debate, crowd out? What are alternative perspectives through which you can actually explain the contemporary situation somewhat better? What are the alternative frameworks through which not only can you explain it better, but you can also perhaps understand what are the points of intervention where politically you can actually intervene and do things differently from the way they're done now? Meaning you will not surrender to the forces of disruption, to a bunch of entrepreneurs, but you will exert some kind of political influence, and you'll actually try to redirect history in a somewhat different direction. So I started working on mapping out, both conceptually and historically, what does a term like the internet actually imply, right? And if you think about it, it's a very tricky task, because for that discourse to function, a lot of assumptions, a lot of other discourses ought to be in place. And if you think about it hard and long, you will see that the way in which we talk about the internet in public discourse, for example, does presuppose the existence of cyberspace as a separate domain of life. So even though the very term cyberspace might not actually be around, with one exception, which I'm going to discuss very soon, it still informs the way in which we think that there is some other world, some other reality, some other domain where the rules are different from the rules that exist in the real world. Right? So when we talk about the internet, there is some assumption of otherness, that the conventional laws, rules, regulations, conventions, habits do not apply there because that space is different, right? And for me, it's if you, again, go and analyze the discourse that does come out of Silicon Valley and out of a lot of political analysis, that assumption is still there. And I would argue that even more explicitly, the only place where the rhetoric of cyberspace actually still exists, and where you can actually go and see people making fundamentally consequential decisions about it, would be defense. So if you go and read the speeches and the actual budgets of the Department of Defense in America, for example, you will see that they're the ones who've taken the idea of cyberspace far more seriously than the postmodernist theorists who were quick to jump on it in the 90s. You would see that those are actually the people who have funded centers for the study of cyber war, who have entire units within the Department of Defense of people showing up in serious military uniform to work, completely convinced that cyberspace exists and must be defended. Right? And those are people then investing millions and billions of dollars into all sorts of surveillance tools, which then allow them to monitor what's happening in cyberspace. Right? And if you actually go and read the US military doctrine, there you would clearly see that those are the decisions made on the assumption that we now have a fifth domain of war. In addition to kinetic warfare and air warfare and sea warfare, we now have cyber warfare, and much of the military activity revolves around that, right? And for me, that's a very interesting development for the sole reason that it shows you that you can actually explain a little bit of what is happening to us today by going and tracing the genealogy of this internet quote-unquote discourse and finding it in places where you probably wouldn't expect to find it, right? But you start from a somewhat different set of methods and departure points, and you actually go and try to look at the NATO center in Tallinn, for example, which is the primary center for studying cyber warfare, and actually you have real military people there sitting, and it's 50 of them, and they're all convinced that cyberspace is there and it's their job to go and think about it every day, right? And that I would argue tying it with then the role that a lot of consultants, military consultants to the Pentagon, had played in articulating the idea of cyberspace would be a very interesting historical move that might not fit within the traditional confines of media theory, media history, but would probably explain why that transition happened. Because if you actually go and trace the genealogy and what actually happened in the adoption of cyberspace as a buzzword by the military, you would see that the one think tank that was key to that happening was the RAND Corporation. That, having lost the favorite hobby horse of the Cold War, because the Cold War was already won by the late 1980s, found themselves kind of unemployable. So they are the ones who actually entered the public discourse with pronouncements that cyber war is coming as early as late 1980s. And they're the ones who consistently, and it's just two people within RAND Corporation, Martin Libitsky is one, and there is another guy who's been working on that issue, who for the last 2 decades consistently shaped the discourse around cyber warfare in publications like The Economist. Right? And they're the ones who are quoted, they're the ones producing reports, they're the ones who are constantly reminding the Defense Department that something must be done, otherwise we'll all be destroyed by hackers taking over the grid and so forth and so forth. Right? That to me, again, is a very interesting development because it allows us to understand the contemporary situation and a lot of the investments that are going into surveillance by linking it much closer to the histories of the Cold War, to the histories of the military in America, to the role of think tanks, to the way in which money flows and informs policy. Again, it's not a traditional tactic in much of the media studies research, but to me, it explains the contemporary situation somewhat better. To the same extent, in a somewhat similar mode, we can think about much of the current technological environment that we would call the internet. Take social networking, for example, or take Twitter. And the way in which, again, in popular discourse, in some of the academic discourses, we tend to go and pick a site like Facebook or a site like Twitter and basically say that, well, there is some kind of a propensity or affinity that this platform show towards generating distraction, towards being in real time, towards inundating us with data, towards hijacking our attention. And we go on trying to understand how the effects that they do produce, and those effects, I think we have little disagreement that they do produce a lot of distraction, how they somehow relate to the design of the sites and platforms, or how they relate to some broader conception of digital culture as always being available, permanent, real time, being in the cloud, available on demand, and so forth. And I think that a lot of those narratives are correct. But I also think that we would probably go much further, not just in understanding the contemporary situation, but also in disrupting it, to reclaim the word disrupt from the Silicon Valley types, if you will, if we actually make the most simple and, to me, straightforward assumption that the reason why so much of this media is distracting is because they operate on an assumption that every click is a data point, right? And there is a lot of value in capturing every click that you make, and by extension, there is a lot of value in actually making you click as many links as you can. And that's the process of clicking that right now generates value for them, and not actually the process of sharing. Because the more clicks you generate, the more filled in your informational profile is. And the better filled in your informational profile is, the more value you generate for those companies as a user. Because again, it's all tied to advertising, and it's all tied to the value that this data has on the advertising market, right? And from this perspective, to me, it's obvious that the reason why Twitter is addictive, and the reason why Twitter constantly changes in a way that we are bombarded with many more notifications, and those of you who use Twitter heavily would know that Twitter today looks very different from Twitter 6 months ago, because right now, Twitter, for example, if you use it on the site itself, will always bring you a pop-up and a little notification saying that somebody has retweeted your message. They'll actually show you who it is without you doing anything. I mean, there is a reason why Twitter does all of that. And I think, as much as I would want to say that it has something to do with the intrinsic teleology of digital culture, it has everything to do with the fact that Twitter has to raise revenue, because otherwise their market value will kind of collapse after the IPO. That's the pressure that comes from Silicon Valley, and it's a value that comes from Wall Street and venture capitalists. So the destruction that we so often attribute to the sites and platforms, I think, is to be found on Wall Street and in the valuation models of these companies, and not so much to be found in some broader cultural analysis of digital culture, even though all of that, I think, is tremendously important. And that, by the way, will actually, from an activist perspective, probably enable us to start thinking of Silicon Valley and, if you will, big data, if you want to use the term big data in the same way in which we use terms like big food, or big money, or big pharma, in a way that reveals the actual economic agenda of the players involved. And there you would clearly see that the way in which the food companies and the junk food companies are artificially adding salt or fat in their food products in order to make you crave them even more, and thus buy them even more, is not very different from the way in which Twitter and Facebook artificially design their sites in order to make you click more and distract you more, so that they extract more data and more information from you. And from that perspective, I think we again will see a lot of similarities with other historical and sociological projects that try to look at the role that corporations play in public life, or the way in which the framing of all of this as a purely issue of consumer welfare has actually allowed corporations to do as much damage as we did. So anyway, the broader point I'm trying to make is that we can look at the problem of distraction from many different vantage points. And I think that there is a lot to be learned by tying many of these digital platforms to the broader set of political and economic issues that they're facing today. Right? The same, by the way, I would say applies even more so to a lot of critiques that we apply to social media when we think about the way in which they mechanize and automate, if you will, our cognitive ability, subjectivity, I mean, whatever term you want to use here, but the way in which they mechanize our sort of what makes us human, to sort of, without getting into the contentious theoretical terms here. And there again, I think a project, an app like Google Now, and I'll explain for you what it is for those of you who don't use it, I think is a good example again of how you can come up with several alternative views that would explain why it does what it does, one of which will lean much more heavily on a political and economic rationale and try to link it to the much broader sort of macro level questions of capitalism, neoliberalism, value of data, and then you can also easily link it to many more other dimensions and ways of talking that will specify the sort of the broader acceptance of mechanization of cognition by cyberneticians, if you want to sort of follow the argument of Jean-Pierre Dupuy, or if you want to follow sort of the broader critique of artificial intelligence by Dreyfus. I mean, there are all sorts of other historical and cultural narratives through which you can explain it. And to me, it's not obvious that the cultural and historical critique provides any better answer than the economic and political one. So let's sort of concretize this a little bit. So if you think about Google Now, Google Now, for those of you who don't know, is an app that first was available on your smartphone and now is also available on your laptop through a browser. And it's an app that I think reflects perfectly Google's vision for the future of search. So what Google Now does is basically draw on as many sources of data that Google has collected about you in order to make predictions about what it is you'll be doing with your life in the next 24 hours or so, right? So the sources of data that it draws upon are various. Of course, search, since you always use search when you use Google, but it also draws upon your Gmail. It also draws upon your geolocation, because since on your Android phone, Google understands where you are. And it draws on any of the other Google services, from YouTube to Calendar to Google Scholar to Google Books, that you might have used in the past. And the way it works is very easy to understand. For example, if you have a plane reservation in your Gmail account, because you've booked a plane ticket and you have a plane to catch tomorrow, Google, drawing again on its ability to categorize everything that's happening in your inbox, knows that a particular email is a plane reservation because it comes from a particular airline, right? So automatically it knows that this is a plane reservation. It informs you that you have a flight coming up. It knows which airport you have to go to, so it automatically gives you the directions. It automatically checks the traffic conditions on the way to the airport, because again, there is a way to check it in real time. It provides you when you have to leave your house or your departure point to arrive there on time, again, based on real-time conditions. And it also shows you any of the traffic accidents that might have happened. The weather at your destination, basically it shows you everything that you might need to know given this particular point in your life that you have to travel. And it does the same predictions for everything. Hotels, if it knows that you're standing next to a cinema theater, it will show you that there are 5 films that are being shown right now, perhaps, and that's the film that you might like based on the films you liked before. The basic principle here, again, is very simple. Google has understood that the value that it provides to the user is actually not information, it's time, right? And that the way in which they can minimize the number of clicks and the number of interactions and the number of time that you spend searching for information, you would think about it that Google would actually want to maximize it, because by maximizing it, Google will actually be able to derive more value. But Google itself has understood that if it wants to play long term, if it really wants to become a company that will not be able to be disrupted, what it needs to do is to gather as much data about us as possible, and then to make as many predictions as possible, thus making it impossible for any other competitor to step in and try to offer a better search. Right? So the way in which Google constantly tells you what it is that you'll be doing in the next 2 hours, we are standing next to a cinema because it knows that building is a cinema. Right? And if you think about it, with that massive informational set of properties that it has amassed, it's impossible to do anything with Google. I mean, for a competitor, it's impossible to disrupt them because it's not the algorithms at this point that actually make them so successful. And the future of search for Google is very simple. And Eric Schmidt and a lot of other Google senior executives are very plain on that issue. They actually say it explicitly, that they think that the future of search is some kind of serendipity engine, where basically your phone or your browser tells you in real time what it is that you want and what it is that you would want in the next hour, again, based on the idea of A, surveillance, constant monitoring, and B, on the idea of predictive analytics, right? Where you don't even have to go and search, because the information will find you on its own. Right? Again, that has nothing to do with algorithms, right? Or it has something to do with algorithms only peripherally. It has everything to do with what Google already knows about you, right? And the way in which it is being accepted massively by people partially might have to do with the way in which we are fascinated by gadgets, technology, and so forth. But I think it has much more to do with the fact that most of us are starved for time, and most of us actually are quite happy to accept the convenience, and by convenience, I mean time convenience, first of all, that apps and tools like this offer. In part because this is what they do. They help us, again, to use the jargon of Silicon Valley, is to hijack and to hack, if you really want to use that jargon, is to hack the lives under the conditions of neoliberalism. And the life under the conditions of neoliberalism is that we just don't have any time because we spend most of the time working. So if you do want to have a lifestyle, if you don't want to have a life, but you don't have the time to do research on things that do not fit into the working project, be it culture, cuisine, films, travel, whatever. Google will do all of that for you. They're saving you the time that you'd otherwise spend on any of those projects. And here you clearly see that you can also very easily explain a project like Google Now through a perspective that is much tighter integrated with the way in which we think about sociology of work, with the way in which we think about sociology of time, the way in which we actually start from the condition that the amount of time that we have is constantly shrinking and working from there. And if you work from there, you'll actually see that Google Now, yes, might be a unique, interesting tool that draws on artificial intelligence and that relies a lot on data, but the reason for its appearance and the reason for its success probably has to do with the fact that you have a company that has managed to convert data into time. And time is the scarcest commodity that exists under conditions where everybody is supposed to be working 24/7. And for me, that's a perspective on Google and Google Now that is very hard to get if we remain within what I would call internet discourse. And internet discourse can also be, digital discourse. It's a matter of semantics, how you want to call it. But the fact is that to make those kind of critiques and to even understand those pressure points, we do need to problematize things that are very hard to problematize if we keep just looking at the media and the objects. And here we do need to bring perspectives like work, financialization, and so forth. Moving on from there, I would just like to highlight that the alternative to Google Now, by the way, the only alternative that we have with regards to data, and that also indicates why I think we're in a very dire situation right now, is that instead of giving all this data to Google, which essentially is the project, right? You understand that the reason why Google Now can work is because they are sucking in all the data from us. If we start erecting barriers around it, if we start saying that, well, Google, this data is mine, I'm not going to share it because it has a value, then Google Now will not be functional, right? So the reason why Google can do what it does, A, is because they can suck in all the data, but B, because we basically have no problem, at least so far in Europe and America, letting it be in every single domain in which they want to be. So if Google wants to start pulling data from your bedrooms through its smart thermostats, if they want to start pulling data from your cars through a self-driving car, if they want to pull your data from your glasses through the smart lenses, if they want to pull your data from all of the services that they run, right, we allow them, right? And it's a classical kind of defense that you would hear from big monopolists, because they would say that it's their size that actually increases consumer welfare. It's their size that generates the kind of savings, whether it's time, money, or something else, that would be impossible if you actually broke up the monopolists. In the case of Google, you can see that defense work very clearly. If Google was smaller, or if Google could not enter every single domain that it wanted, the kind of analysis that it produces would also be impossible. So one of the reasons why Google is allowed to do what it does is because our antitrust laws look the way they do. And the way they do look is that we actually tolerate monopolists because they think they ensure consumer welfare, because consumer welfare under conditions of neoliberalism, again, is the only benchmark that we know how to assess, right? That's the paradigm, again, in which we live. And that also means that you can actually start bringing additional resources from legal theory, from economic theory, from sort of critiques of antitrust law, critiques of Chicago School and so forth into the analysis, and thus coming up with a much richer perspective as to what it is that Google is and what it is that Google does that have very little to do with the exceptionalism of the digital, whether you want to endorse it or whether you want to criticize it as being ahistorical and so forth. But the other alternative that we are presented with is also very limited and also very limiting. So if you think about what it is that we have managed to produce to counter this vision where Google sucks in all the data, and the only thing that we have managed to articulate so far as an alternative is a regime where all of us can be put in charge of our own data so that we can actually participate in the market as entrepreneurs selling it. That's the critique of Google articulated by people like Jaron Lanier. That's the critique of Google and Facebook that's articulated by the World Economic Forum and Sandy Pentland, and the idea that they have for what they call the new data, the New Deal for data. It's the idea behind what they would call the data as an asset class. The idea there, again, the premise is that data is a commodity, there is a property regime around it, and we should be allowed to transact in it as individuals, and we should be able to collect it. And Silicon Valley, companies that are smaller than Google, would be invited in to help us collect as much data as we can about us and then put it on the market, right? And you can clearly see that this process in itself is also probably far better understood through many other analytical lenses, like, again, a critique that would, for example, position financialization of everyday life as one of the key problems of neoliberalism. And there you can clearly see how it relates to financialization, because the value of the data that you gather about yourself, it's never actually stable. And it's not stable in a sense that everything that you do and everything that is captured about you, the value of that data differs based on where you are and who you interact with. So the fact that the fact that you're singing in the shower this morning, like the value of that fact and the knowledge of the song that you were singing, that data point costs much more if you are walking past the supermarket than if you're sitting in this room. Because based on the current economic system that we have, the value of that data point is determined in an exchange of advertisers. And it just happens that the behavior that you engage in the shower is much more valuable to the person who runs the supermarket than to the person who runs the Academy of Art, right? Which means that if you extend the paradigm where we're all data entrepreneurs into everyday life, you end up in a situation where you're actually never sure about what it is that you're not collecting about yourself that does not maximize the total value of a data portfolio. Right? Because there is always something else you can add that will increase how valuable you are as a participant in the market. Right? And if that's the case, then basically the solution that is presented to us as a way to liberate ourselves from data monopolies of Google and Facebook ends up by converting all of us into perpetual market players who are just trying to optimize how much value we can derive from the data that we generate. I mean, to me, that's again, the consequence of framing a critique of Google and Facebook solely through digital terms, right? Because if you think about it, the reason why so many otherwise smart and intelligent people get caught up in this trap that, we need to do something about Google and Facebook, and thus we need to become owners of our own data and be able to sell it, is because, they hate Silicon Valley so much that any kind of Google bashing in itself distracts from the fact that the vision that they offer in itself might actually be much more horrifying in terms of the effects it's going to have on your everyday life and your subjectivity. Because the other model where you are in charge of trading and you are trading 24/7 with some kind of an app in your phone that just alerts you that somebody is interested in buying this particular fact about you, would you do it or not? Right? I mean, that's the future. I mean, that you will have, and by the way, that's the future that Larry Lasser already articulated as a positive future, by the way, in code in the late 90s. He already talked about some kind of electronic butler on your phone, on your computer, that will be engaged in that kind of exchange in a 24/7 basis. But the reason why I'm saying this is that if you think about it very hard, again, to me, it's not obvious why that option is better from a political and economic perspective, even if it happens to destroy Google, right? And you can see clearly how the ways in which our digital debate operates kind of conceals the politics of the solutions, in part because we think that the problem with the contemporary world is Google, Facebook, Silicon Valley, and it's not money, capitalism, and everything else. Right? And the way I think in which we can recover some of that other language is to precisely trying to understand what role the very notion of the digital plays in how we frame our problems. But of course, there are more than two solutions here, right? And the third solution is not on the table, but I'll try to bring it towards the end. But just to reiterate, I think the reason why, again, we are fixated, we are caught up between these two poles. On the one hand, the vision for a monopoly that sucks in as much data as possible from as many sources as possible. And on the other hand, a kind of full-blown entrepreneurship where we are trying to monitor ourselves to make money from it, is because this situation actually benefits the state, not to mention the commercial players, and it benefits it for three reasons. And here I think we do need to bring in yet a third perspective that will be much more critical in terms of engaging with the state as a state form, and that will actually bring in even sociology of state and the theory of the state into the limelight, because I think that we understand one of those forms really well, or at least better than the others, and it's the security state. It's the idea that basically the reason why many of these companies, and Silicon Valley in general, Google and Facebook, and many of the other players in this field, were allowed to do what they do, is precisely because they actually help the national security agencies of the world to organize the data that would otherwise would be extremely difficult and expensive to organize. So in some sense, it's a form of outsourcing where Silicon Valley does the sorting that otherwise the NSAs of this world will need to do in-house. So once all the sorting is done, then you can conveniently come in and get that data from them, thus saving on the actual costs. And instead, you can hire more analysts to do the actual analytics. So again, once you start introducing those frameworks, again, I think that you will see that there is far more in common that the digital and Silicon Valley has in terms of how outsourcing of this to the private sector has affected all the other domains and fields of Western governments, whether it's the prison system or something else, than the accounts of the digital that treat it as exceptional would suggest. But I think there are other two forms of the state, if you will, that will explain why the choices that we face are so dire. And the second issue here is somewhat related to the security state, but I think it would be proper to call it the nudging state. And what I mean by the nudging state is that, again, due to the high demand for certain types of policy advice that are tied to behavioral economics, that are tied to the idea of nudging proposed and promoted by Cass Sunstein, Richard Taylor, and perhaps Daniel Kahneman as the architect of the entire scheme, there is a very interesting intellectual alliance that you now see emerge between companies running technological informational infrastructure that we use on a daily basis and policymakers who are interested in solving various social and political problems through this particular mode of solving problems, which is nudging, right? And for those of you who don't know, the idea behind nudging and behavioral economics as applied in this sphere is very simple. It's the idea that many of the problems that we have in our lives, whether it's the fact that we do not save enough money for retirement, or that we overconsume energy in our houses, or that we tend not to exercise enough, or that we don't eat enough healthy food, is because basically we lack the right information, and that information is not delivered at the right time, and that the choices that we make are presented to us in a way that does not promote our own good, right? So what a lot of these behavioral theorists want to do is to basically intervene in the process of decision-making of individual citizens to try to make them do the right thing. right? Or at least try to suggest to them that doing the right thing is in their own interest. And that means that many of the forms that we fill in, many of the choices that we make in our food cafeterias, many of the choices that we make about whether we want to walk or take the public transport, whether we want to eat a doner, whether we want to eat quinoa, I mean, all of those choices become monitored, and all of those choices become subjects for intervention in real time by the decision makers who want to tinker with what they would call choice architecture. Right? That's the term that Cass Sunstein has come up with to explain the whole kind of set of tools at his disposal. And if you think about the project of behavioral economics as such, which is all about governing the subjects and not at all governing the causes of politics and not at all about governing the sort of rationales that create problems in the first place, you can clearly see how nicely the real-time infrastructure for problem solving and monitoring offered by Silicon Valley and technology companies, how conducive it is to that agenda, right? For the sole reason that all of these companies and all of these players are already collecting and monitoring so much data in real time, and they already have the infrastructure like screens to actually intervene at the right time to push us to doing the right thing, that there is a natural alliance between them and through various entities and organizations, which of course you can go and map. I mean, they exist, those are real entities. It's organizations like Nesta, for example, in the United Kingdom. It's various quasi-academic units that exist in the rest of Europe. It's a lot of think tanks that exist in America. They go and convince that policymakers that they ought to work with Silicon Valley on trying to become more responsible players and helping us solve many of the social ills. Right? So the way it works with Google now, for example, the example I've already mentioned is that Google, since it has sensors in your smartphone and your Android phone, it already monitors how much walking you do anyway, right? So at the end of the month, Google will show you a card telling you that this month you have walked 2 more miles than the months before, and this is good. It will show you that you have walked less, and this is bad. Right? And the idea there is, again, that Google, on the one hand, positions itself as a benevolent company that can help us solve all of the world's problems, but at the same time, you can clearly see how the way through which a problem like health or obesity or whatever, or even climate change is handled in itself becomes much more information heavy, much more information dependent, and basically becomes a problem of regulating the effects rather than regulating the causes, which was what politics at one point used to be about. That instead of actually assuming that you should use whatever tool at your disposal to try to fight climate change or try to fight, obesity or terrorism, you would actually try to politically figure out how you want to distribute the blame, right? And figure out that the reason why climate change might exist is not only because we are over-consuming energy in our houses, but also probably because there are a lot of energy companies out there who are polluting and who will not be nudged in any way ever, right? And you can clearly see in how, in itself, the adoption of these methods at the expense of other methods then in itself is a political gesture because it crowds out certain ways of doing politics, because it no longer actually fixates on various social and political players that go beyond the individual, because it's the individual unit, it's the individual citizen who has become the focus around which all that data is being collected, or at least most of the data is being collected, and that can be acted upon. Despite all of the hype around themes like open government, what you see is that most of the decidedly political facets of how modern governance works never become visible for all sorts of reasons and rationales, and that has to do with the way, again, in which governments have offloaded some of their functions to private players who are not even subject to freedom of information laws, has to do with the way in which a lot of private companies actually involved in the production of ignorance, what some of you might know as agnotology. They're actually funding a lot of research that tries to disrupt the current understanding of climate change, for example. There are a lot of corporate and political actors out there who are actually doing their best for us not to know what it is that they do. The only unit of analysis that is becoming far more transparent is, of course, the citizen, right? And it's through the citizen that much of the governance now happens by regulating our own behavior. And again, everything that I'm saying now will not be news to any of you who are familiar with social theory, particular strands of it, who know about governance and capitalism and so forth. None of that is new. It fits within a trajectory of how governance itself has been evolving and shifting under various conditions. And again, there you can clearly connect it to various strands and how we understand neoliberalism and so forth. I don't want to go into that issue. The only reason why I'm bringing that up is that if you actually start problematizing this issue from that end, you will see that there is far more continuity in what's happening than the kind of exceptionalism that you would normally get if you just focus on the digital, the internet, the devices, and so forth. And the third state that I mentioned, and I said that there are three kind of states, if you will, that are responsible for the two direct choices that we have. It's the bankrupt state, right? So the security state, the nudging state, the bankrupt state. And what I mean by the bankrupt state is that our governments have realized that data has immense economic value. Right? And that if collected in the right quantities and shared with the right parties, it can actually help to fill in the gaps in their budgets that otherwise would look very outrageous. Right? So what is happening, and you can clearly see it if you follow the British example closely, you can see that the British government has gone the furthest in actually trying to understand how much value they can derive from what I would say privatizing the data. I mean, once you have privatized everything else, like the next frontier is that you privatize the data. So, and the more data you collect, the better. So what they're doing, they try to do it with health data by selling the NHS data to all sorts of big pharma companies. I mean, that generated a lot of anxiety and pushback, but they managed to do it with student data. So the data that is recorded in the process of students applying to colleges is shared with companies manufacturing soft drinks and mobile operators, and is then tied to advertising that they sell. Right? So the governments in themselves have understood that it's not in their interest to do anything here. And the citizens, by the way, have also understood that data, if they do buy into this entrepreneurial model that I have described, can actually help them earn some money, which otherwise they're not going to get because real incomes and wages are stagnating, right? And it's the same argument, by the way, through which you can explain much of the activity in the sharing economy, where suddenly governments look at the Ubers and Airbnbs of the world as a way to generate at least some economic activity, but the citizens who, again, are either struggling with stagnating incomes or actually unemployed, have no other choice but to figure out how they can make their already existing assets more productive by fitting them in, essentially, with all sorts of sensors and putting them on the market so that they remain in circulation forever. That's what's happening with apartments in the case of Airbnb. That's what's happening with free time if you think about services like Uber or TaskRabbit. That's what's happening with many other services. I mean, right now, in America, for example, Verizon, which is one of the largest mobile operators, has just launched a program called AutoShare, where basically you would be able, by just using a QR code and a smartphone, to share any car with whoever, right? And they want to offer it as a service so that Verizon will be offering the infrastructures through which, through the phone, you can unlock the car, right? And they actually want to expand that to every other asset, right? So you can start sharing everything, loan owners, tables, tablets, anything on which you can attach some kind of an electronic lock. If you have a secure system through which you can unlock it on your phone, you will be able to share that asset, right? And again, if you fall into a certain trap of explaining this as a natural feature of the digital revolution, however you want to call it, that we're all becoming much more willing to share and trade, all the blah, blah, blah that you'll hear from the proponents of sharing economy. I mean, that's one way to explain it. Another way to explain it is that, well, if you have to pay your bills and you don't have any other assets and you have the sensors through which you can make your already existing assets more productive, well, you'll probably do it. Right? So the way in which some of this behavior can be explained, again, by focusing on where the money goes and flows, I think is in itself an interesting perspective that we would benefit from looking a little bit more closely. And that also brings me to the question of sort of the citizen and the user and how our interaction with many of these platforms does result in a certain subjectivity formation, right? And that subjectivity, I would argue, as you can see with the sharing economy example, is again geared towards making us participate in the market all the time and with as much effort as possible, and embracing as much of the market mentality into the domains of life that were previously not subject to it than before. And here you can see it not only in the sharing economy example, not only in the example of personal data, you can also see it very clearly in the ways through which something like the reputation economy, which again has been presented to us as one of the features that come out of digital culture, and that process is quite natural, and it's us replacing our old IDs and our old other forms like CVs with an entirely new set of attributes that again is itself presented quite often as just an evolution of our Facebook profile. But I would argue that there are also alternative ways through which you can read even something like the reputation economy, right? And the way to read it, alternatively, I would argue, is that you really have to look at the way in which it is presented discursively by the likes of Uber and Airbnb. What the likes of Uber and Airbnb argue is that by essentially having everyone acquire a reputation that is visible to all other market players, you can basically get rid of regulation altogether. So it's the reputation that becomes the new regulatory mechanism, if you will. It's the fact that if you are being driven by a driver who has a smelly sandwich in his car, and you can immediately have it reflected in the rating that you give him, that in itself will punish him in a way that a normal set of regulations applied proactively will not accomplish, right? And it's the same, by the way, with Airbnb. And the idea is that you will not only be marking the providers of services, but you'll also be marking the passenger. You will also be marking the clients, right? So you as a passenger is being ranked. You as somebody who and you are actually ranked if you use Uber. So all of you are ranked as customers. So the driver also ranks whether you have a smelly sandwich in your bag, right? And it's the same with Airbnb, right? But again, it's a much better explanatory device to think about the role that reputation plays here if you actually go back and try to understand how, for example, somebody like Hayek had argued that it's the market itself that is always better at incorporating all the knowledge about market participants that any kind of ambiguous idea of social justice can ever provide and accomplish. So if you go and actually engage with the debate around socialist planning, for example, that the so-called socialist calculation debate that Hayek had with economists who were much more sympathetic to the idea of centralized planning, Hayek's argument against centralized planning has always been that the market is much better at reflecting the actual reputation of the market participants. So there will always be some knowledge that will be incorporated in the price structure, in the value of it, that you cannot actually detect, record, and store somewhere, and it will always be more effective and much more just than any alternative conception, right? And if you go and try to analyze some of the contemporary startups, platforms, and things that are happening, you'll actually see how clearly they actually fall within that projection, right? And I mean, I can go on for another hour actually explaining how the idea of social democracy is completely bankrupt, and that while the idea of socialist planning actually looks much better now in the age of Internet of Things, big data, and anticipatory shipping that it ever did, that essentially the debate we're facing in the next 15 years is the debate between capitalism and communism, and not between capitalism and social democracy. Social democracy, I think, is finished, but I'm not going to make that argument in the 1 or 2 minutes that are remaining. I would just want to highlight one particular issue. And I think that if there is something that I want you to remember from this talk, it's that the key debate and the key issue that would emerge from this alternative reading of the contemporary situation that I tried to outline and highlight is that the key issue is who owns the data. Right? Whether it's you, whether it's the company, or whether it's an entirely new arrangement for collective ownership of data that does not even fit within the private property paradigm is the key question that will define how many of the services that we use will be provided, right? And it will also define how much of the world will look like, because it's the data that will power either this hyper-capitalism that will incorporate all the information about market participants in real time, and thus we will move completely into the Hayekian paradise, right, as he would think of this as paradise, or we would move to a very different model where we would actually be relying on the same feedback loops and be relying on the same sensors and the same algorithms and the same kind of sources of data and the same databases in order to come up with a very different model of centralized social planning that will, in one way or another, be as effective as Walmart is today, which is, by the way, a company that does rely on all of those things and works in a manner that is extremely centralized. And that actually, if you think about it, looks much more like centralized socialist planning than the kind of free market model that you will see somewhere else. So on this provocative note, I think I will stop. And I don't know if you have any time for questions, but.
I hope so. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. Of course, we have time for questions and for answers too, hopefully. I would like to start and give you a minute to breathe and to think about good questions and maybe answers as well. Because I was very, very happy that after your critique on the Silicon Valley and the maybe economic, informational, military complex, as you may call it, you ended up at us, delivering willingly all the data or information. I'm not sure if it's the same, but we may talk about it. And that reminds me of Google Home View. You may know Google Home View. That's a satirical project in Germany that two journalists arrived with baseball caps with Google on it, and they said, sorry, we're from Google, and now the new thing is Google Home View, so we have to come in and to photograph your bedroom and your bathroom and everything. And most of them said, oh, if it's the case, please feel free, come in, and then they photographed everything. So, but that's not the question. The question is, Dirk Baecker, who just left, proposed the idea this morning that the dominant medium of the current society, the society 4.0, I think he called it, is no longer money, yes, but information. Yes. And I would like to hear what you say about that.
Well, if we lived in a world where that information didn't have any value attached to it, I would say that, yes, I'm happy with that framing. But unfortunately, the reason why all of that data is collected, outside of the sort of nudging security rationales that I've also outlined, which, by the way, even the nudging and security rationales can be tied in some way to the sociology of the state, because you can clearly see that the governments being broke and having no money cannot engage in the kind of ambitious policy making that they did before. So all they do is just focus on individuals, and focusing on individuals kind of forces them to collect data. But that in itself is a consequence of them being broke, right? So even that is a question of money. But I wouldn't go at all into thinking that we have somehow transcended the question of money. I mean, to me, it's not. I just don't see it. I mean, you can clearly see that the reason why Facebook or Amazon have enormous values on the stock market does not reflect at all what they make. I mean, Amazon has been losing money for a very long time, and but they have tremendous market capitalization, right? And I want to know why, right? And I think there is some kind of a theory that probably investors have that would explain why those companies are valued what they're valued, right? And I think what they're valued is in part reflects the value that they hold of user data. And that the reason why a company like WhatsApp, which is basically at this point is a collection of, it's a social graph. Yeah. It's how people connect to each other. It can be valued at $19 billion, right? I doubt that they paid $19 billion for 19 engineers, how many they got from WhatsApp, right? Which to me, I mean, it's very hard for me to accept that as a reality that we live in, because to me it's obvious that the question of the financial value of data is the question that's staring us in the face. I mean, it's there, and and it's what I fear is that we'll opt for this route that Silicon Valley also gives us, and it's that we have to go and bash Google and get our own data and then sell it, and then somebody else will buy it, and then Google will go and buy it from us back. And, you know, but like the extension of the private property paradigm into everything, I mean, that's also what's happening with data in a sense, right? And I'm not sure that that's the right paradigm. I mean, in a sense, you would know that in Europe, if not in America, which I think is a lost case, I mean, we've had a debate about whether things like water should be treated as commodity and whether you should actually run them under a certain economic privatized model, right? And we have the same debates about air, and we have the same debates about many other things. And I feel that Silicon Valley, and again, here I don't want to attribute too much causality to Silicon Valley because, again, it's not just them, it's also the state and Wall Street and whatever, but I mean, it's that constellation of actors has made a decision for us, or is close to making it, that data is an asset class. The private property paradigm applies to it, and we should be trading it. And I'm not sure that that's a decision we should allow them to make, right? So, but, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you all know the case of the Dutch student, Sean Buckles. So some of you may have heard of the case where 6 months ago, he just basically put up all of his private data online, all his passwords, all his notes, all his medical data, and said, I'm going to sell it to the highest bidder. And 30 or something bidders came, and he sold it for 350 euros. And I mean, I don't know, like, does it look like an anecdote that kind of suggests that there is still some value to the data? I don't know. But to me, as long as there is a market for it, I feel like money has not become obsolete.
Okay. Gabriel Coleman has...
I already got the microphone. I had my hand up. I don't want to preempt, but maybe we could keep the exchange short so we can fit in more questions.
Oh, we can take more questions.
You want to go first? No? Okay. Just really quickly, thank you very much for this tour de force. There's so much to ask, so much to say. I'm going to boil it down to one comment and one question. I thought it fit in quite nicely with the presentation Laszlo was giving us on cybernetics, just because the utopian cybernetic dream that was voiced after the Second World War, at the Macy conferences, everyone getting together and thinking they could solve social ills through this cybernetic mode of thinking, is actually what we're seeing here through the perpetuation of feedback loops. And this is quite dystopian when one listens to you talk about it. That was my comment, and my question is, if you've spent any time thinking about how this ties into the whole hype around gamification that we've been hearing in the past 5 years, and the whole nudge economy and behavioral economics, because you're talking about us having no time and us working 24/7, but somehow there are a lot of people out there trying to convince us that what we're doing is actually playing 24/7, and there's this weird leakage there, and I could see bridges that one could make, and maybe you've thought about that connection.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have actually a chapter on gamification in my last book. I mean, I have thought about it quite a bit, and I think the answer I can give you is that if you, again, focus on the mentality of the players that, from Silicon Valley, for example, who step in and present themselves as sort of social innovators. I mean, that's the buzzword that everybody likes, social innovation. It's as if it's innovation, but with sort of the nice face of social democracy. We kind of tend to be responsible, blah, blah, blah. I mean, and they would claim that, well, we can come in and solve many of the social problems, right? Essentially by getting people to do the right thing without necessarily having any understanding what it is that they do, right? I mean, that's one of the sort of good things about gamification is that you can get people to do things for reasons other than grasping the actual rationale as to why you're doing it, right? So you can go and, pick up, like dog shit from the pavement, right? Because you're playing a game on Facebook, not because you think that picking up dog shit is good, right? So in that sense, it lends itself very perfectly to the nudging state where, on the one hand, because you rely on a set of commercial intermediaries like Facebook, there is some kind of a currency involved, even if it's a social currency. I mean, you can be incentivized to do things purely for reputational purposes, right? So the fact that you are, cleaning that street will be reflected somewhere in your reputation, right? So in that sense, I mean, it fits, I think, quite nicely. I mean, again, I do not claim that exhausts all the possible uses of gamification, and of course, you can also use it to, offer critique of society and engage in sort of artistic critique. I mean, all of that is also valid. What I'm concerned about, again, is the use of the social aspect here. So if you think, again, I'll just give you one last example. If you look at somebody like Sandy Pentland, who's, is now pushing for this new big deal for data, the MIT guy, he had this very interesting experiment a few years ago where he basically would get people to pair up with each other to influence each other to exercise more and to walk more. So he would pair people up, right? And he would notice that people who already know each other, right, who have some social connection already, are much more effective at influencing whoever they talk to than people who are kind of strangers, right? A very basic insight, right? And it's the same insight that's now been applied to get people to vote, right? So if you show people a pop-up on Facebook telling them that 5 of their Facebook friends have already voted, right? The number of people who vote is much greater if you just tell them that, well, you should go and vote and these 5 strangers have voted, right? So the fact that you can actually deploy the social graph for the purposes of getting people to do things, whether those things have to do with voting or with exercising or with something else, I think is a tremendous kind of shift in terms of how you can govern, right, and how much power you can exercise. So for me, it fits quite nicely. To what extent you need the logic of the game here, and to what extent just having some kind of a social layer where you know that like your friends are involved is enough. I don't know, but again, all of that said, I do not in any way essentialize gamification as something that can only be useful for that nudging project, right? It's just that the current configuration of players in this field provide funding which favors certain projects. It doesn't mean that there are no interesting artists doing certain interesting things. Right?
Well, I just want to say I really enjoyed your talk, and I really like how you bring a perspective that centralizes neoliberalism and its relationship to the government to understand how technologies are designed and how we're interpolated through them. And for those that like this topic, there's a book, Addiction by Design, by Natasha Schull, that looks at casinos, but it's an amazing ethnography that really does the detailed ethnographic work looking at those different levels and relationships. I also really appreciate you wanting to decenter the term the internet, but it is such a difficult thing to do because it is in such common usage everywhere, right? And as someone who's quite invested in looking at forms of politics that rely on digital technologies, but for the fight against neoliberalism implicitly or explicitly, I often struggle because when I use terminology like the internet, what happens is that it designates these singular trends that you talked about, whereas I don't want to point in that direction. And unlike and this has always been something of a mystery to me, so we have something called the book, right, that has been in existence for a very long time, but we have the novel, poetry. We have different genres for designating what the book is, and I feel like we don't have a kind of similar set of ways to distinguish different kind of genres of life online, if that makes sense. It's always kind of falls back on the singularity. So I basically just have a question that is almost advice. If I'm sort of referring to these internet-based forms of politics, but really not of the form that you're talking about, what is the best way linguistically or conceptually in some ways to differentiate it?
Sure. So it's a very good question, and that's something I should have mentioned in my talk. I mean, there is clearly a way in which whether you call it the internet or the digital or this constellation of terms, it can be extremely productive even in the fight against some of the forces I've identified, whether the security state or whether it's the surveillance state or whatever. I mean, and you can clearly see how many of the emerging social movements, whether it's Anonymous that you study or whether it's the Pirate Party that has kind of collapsed in this country, but still was once seen as a beacon of hope, how they have jumped on this very rhetoric, even like internet freedom, to articulate a project that was extremely different from the one articulated by Hillary Clinton. So all of that is true, and I agree with that. For me, though, and the fact that you bring up the example of the book is also very interesting, because the way in which, the reason why I feel so ambivalent about using the very term, the internet, and why I feel somewhat ambivalent about the role that some of the media history and media studies play in this, is that if you closely look at how people frame the digital revolution, yes, the most common trope and comparison that comes to mind and that they use is that it's just like the Gutenberg revolution. It's just like the printing press. So the impact of the internet will be similar to the impact of the printing press, right? So essentially you take the printing press and the printing, whatever, the book as your object, right? And you think that it has certain qualities, transmissibility, portability, blah, blah, blah. Elizabeth Eisenstein did it in her work really well. And then you do the same with the internet, and then you compare them, right? And it would be a kind of comparing of the inventories that Marshall McLuhan would talk about. You need to go and compare the inventories of effects of these technologies, and then you will figure out what has actually changed. The problem with that approach, of course, as many critics of Elizabeth Eisenstein, for example, have pointed out, and Adrian Jones would actually be the first one, is that it helps when you just focus on the end product, right? So you focus on the book as a finished object, and you assume that it already has all of those features, portability and transmissibility and whatever with the other features you ascribe to it, right? Well, in fact, that was, it clearly happened, but the number of contingencies involved in getting there was so huge, were so many, that it's not actually a good idea to ascribe those features to the book as kind of essential natural features of the print culture, right? And my fear is that when we talk about the internet, right, we tend to ascribe certain features to it, like this stuff about distraction I was talking about, right, that are not at all natural features of the internet at all, that in part stem from a bunch of policy choices and decisions that we've made, for example, not to invest into robust infrastructure that will be advertising free, that will have privacy and security by default in design, which in themselves are the results of closed-door policy meetings, some with the European Commission, and have nothing to do with the internal properties of TCP/IP protocol, right? And my fear is that we kind of continue neglecting those factors once we essentialize the internet, the digital, as an object of analysis that can be compared with other media, and we do the same violence to them, if you will, right? So, I mean, I don't have a good answer. I mean, my own response to this has been just to suspend the term and figure out, well, how much you can do with it, right? It's not that I have articulated an alternative paradigm, and I'm not sure that there can be an alternative paradigm, but to even problematize its uses, I think, at this point is not a bad move, because at least it raises awareness about the costs involved in sticking with that discourse.
It seems to be we have to open a new discussion on the discursive light that Deleuze describes concerning to Foucault's dispositif term that enlightens all the things in that we deal with. But I'm afraid of many things, but also that we are running out of time. And I have to thank you a lot for the discussion, and you too.
Thank you.